Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martens Centre with Nicholas Novacki.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Wilfried Martens Centre's Defence Dialogue podcast series. My name is Dr. Nicholas Novacki, and I'm very happy that you have decided to listen to another episode of this podcast series from wherever you might be joining. It's always a delight to have people listening in. And with me here today is my colleague from the communications team, Mr. Theo Laroux. Thank you so much, Theo, for coming again. And this will be your second episode in participating in this series. So thanks again for tagging in.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
We are recording this episode on Wednesday, the 9th of November, which is a day after the US midterm elections. And my initial idea was to make this somehow about the US midterm elections. But given that the full results haven't quite come through yet, and also I haven't, to be completely honest with you, haven't had the proper chance to digest everything and figure out what it actually means for European defense cooperation as well. So I decided to delight you all with a brief discussion on the future of EU-UK security and defense cooperation, because there are some interesting developments in that field as well. As you might know, Britain and the EU haven't cooperated in the field of security and defense since Brexit happened. The UK has, of course, cooperated with NATO, with its European partners, like through NATO and then through frameworks such as the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a British-led initiative in which quite a few European countries participate as well. So the UK is very much an active part and an active element of the European security architecture, but it has shied away from cooperating with the EU as an organization since the Brexit divorce. And the UK's 2021 integrated review on foreign security and defense policy, which was this major document that was produced during the Prime Ministership of Boris Johnson, that gave a broad overview of how the UK sees itself and its place in the world. Also, didn't really mention how the UK sees its relationship developing with the European Union in the field of security and defense. So there's been quite a obvious glaring gap in this field for quite some time. And given, of course, the post-Brexit political climate in London, it's been politically very difficult for any British Prime Minister, since Brexit, to seriously contemplate cooperating with the EU as an organization in many different fields, including security and defense, which Britain has decided to do rather nationally or then through these other frameworks that I just mentioned. But the interesting thing and the reason why I wanted to talk about this topic in today's episode is that now, for the first time since Brexit, there are signs that the UK is moving a little closer to the EU in the field of security and defense. And in particular, during the Prime Ministership of Liz Truss, the UK decided to apply to join the EU's military mobility project, which is a project in the framework of this awfully named initiative called Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO, as it's often called in the Brussels bubble. And military mobility is a Dutch-led project that seeks to cut legal red tape, facilitate the creation of better infrastructure that would then make it easier to move military personnel and other military capabilities within Europe, to make it easier for Europe to respond quickly and in a very timely fashion if something happens within Europe's borders or in the immediate vicinity of Europe. So something that would ultimately be very beneficial also for NATO and would enhance NATO's own deterrence posture, if it is successful in doing what it is set out to do. And PESCO, or Permanent Structured Cooperation, this word monster, is an EU framework that is primarily designed to facilitate the establishment of joint capability development projects. But there are also other kind of like projects and initiatives that have been like set up in the framework of PESCO. But the basic initial idea behind it was that it is only for the most willing and interested and capable countries who want to deepen their cooperation in this specific field. And joining the military mobility project, I think, is a very good issue for the UK, because it wouldn't cost much for Britain domestically. Like, it wouldn't cost a lot of political capital.
Do you think people in the UK pay attention to these kind of things?
No, like, I mean, not a lot. And to be honest with you, I don't think a lot of people like in the EU like pay a lot of attention to it as well.
Yeah,
because
you can hardly expect the British to pay attention when we hardly do.
No, because we're talking about a fairly technical issue here.
Right.
I mean, the EU defense cooperation in general has gotten extremely technical, and like the military mobility, we're talking about like the legal rules and regulations that apply to the movement of military personnel and capabilities, and then traffic infrastructure as well. So it's quite nitty-gritty stuff, not the most sexiest topic, but still very important. But I'm sure like there will be people like diehard Brexiteers who will also pick this up more and more, like once the issue has been approved, and say that Britain has decided to sell its post-Brexit soul and it is now participating in an EU army again, like, which would be a complete nonsense. But I mean, that will of course happen at some way or another. We'll see more of that. I'm absolutely certain. And I think the good thing is that the EU ambassadors, or the member states' ambassadors in the Political and Security Committee, have already approved the Britain's application to participate in this project. So it's been approved at the working group level. And my understanding is that it will be finalized at the Foreign Affairs Council next week. So quite shortly. So by the time this episode is coming out, I mean, you might already want to check the EU website and the news, because by that time it's very possible that the UK has already joined that project.
Do you think that if Putin doesn't invade Ukraine, the UK still joins?
Yeah, I think so, because there are like two, I think, major like driving forces like behind Britain's decision to apply to this project. Like, on the one hand, I think the Ukraine war has highlighted the necessity of boosting cooperation like through different types of fields that make it easier for Europe to respond timely and effective manner to move troops and military capabilities within Europe if something happens either within Europe or in the immediate vicinity. So by participating in this project, the UK will then contribute also to NATO's overall deterrence posture, because if the EU makes it easier to move capabilities and troops within Europe, that will automatically benefit NATO, of course, as well, which is ultimately in charge of like the really hardcore security stuff, such as like deterring Russian aggression against Europe. Right. And then secondly, it's of course kind of motivated by the political desire to improve ties between London and Brussels, like, I mean, which have been like have suffered quite a bit, to be honest, like since the Brexit referendum in 2016, and since Brexit
show good faith on both sides. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's a low-hanging fruit. UK participating in EU defence cooperation as a third country, that will not cost the UK much domestically, because let's remember that EU defence cooperation is an extremely intergovernmental field. The supranational EU institutions like the European Parliament and the Commission have very little to no say in that area. And the UK, in a way, is an equal partner to the extent that is possible to be an equal partner as a third country. But nevertheless, I mean, it is more or less equal to the EU countries participating in this project. And it's easier to sell domestically as well, because in addition to this field being intergovernmental, Canada, the US, and Norway are already participating in military mobility as third countries as well. So Britain can just say that we're simply joining our transatlantic and northern European partners like in this effort. So we're not kind of selling our post-Brexit soul and undermining Brexit in a way. And I think kind of going forward, like, I mean, this will have quite positive impacts on both sides, because I think the initial hope, like if we completely now like overlook the nitty-gritty stuff about military mobility, whether it will succeed in eliminating this legal red tape, and whether it will seek improving Europe's traffic infrastructure and creating dual-use traffic infrastructure that could be used to move military capabilities and forces. It could create this more positive dynamic in the UK's post-Brexit relationship with the EU that could then perhaps like spill over into other areas as well.
Even into civilian infrastructure, for instance?
Yeah, no, but just kind of other policy areas as well. That,
okay.
Like if we create trust and mutual goodwill in the area of defense cooperation.
We show each other we can still do this. Yeah.
Then perhaps kind of things like fisheries policy and disputes over the Northern Ireland Protocol could eventually become a little bit easier to manage as well. Although, like, I mean, we're talking about issues that are a little bit more politically sensitive than this one. But nevertheless, I think there's a possibility that through gradual demonstrations of goodwill, I mean, Britain and the European Union as an organization like could reach a better relationship as well. And so it would be a very cheap way to like improve these EU-UK ties. And I think it's also a recognition of the fact in London that Brexit, although extremely like transformative in many ways for the UK as a society and as a European country, it hasn't fundamentally transformed Britain's geography. So Britain, whatever it might think of the European Union and its willingness to cooperate with the European Union on different issues, it continues to be kind of sucked into these European processes. Like when something happens in Europe, that will of course like impact like Britain in different ways as well. So it's very much in Britain's interest to find these avenues of cooperation, I think, to boost mutual cooperation and create a more positive environment in the post-Brexit relationship, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And have there been any European countries that have been particularly vocal in their support for the UK joining, or has it been more of a uniform approach?
I think I remember kind of seeing that the Dutch, like who lead the project, I mean, have been of course kind of very happy that the welcoming to the UK.
Of course,
and very happy that the UK is joining, and then Baltic countries as well. I mean, of course, like have been very happy because if the UK is participating, and eventually it will become more integrated into the project, to the framework, and it'll be easier for Britain to move its troops and capabilities on the European continent, then like their deterrence and their security will enhance as well. I haven't noticed any country that would have been against that. I think, and the fact that this issue has already been approved at the working group level at the Political and Security Committee, I think speaks volumes about how welcome a development like this is, like in the in the post-Brexit EU-UK relationship. And indeed, I mean, it's very possible, and it looks very much that it'll be approved next week in the Foreign Affairs Council. So again, by the time this is out, I mean, this has already likely happened, and then we'll get a chance to hopefully talk about other aspects of EU-UK cooperation in security and defense. I haven't seen, the interesting thing is that I haven't yet seen much from the new Rishi Sunak government and like what the Sunak government thinks of this, because of course like now there's a new government in London. Liz Truss is no longer a prime minister, and I would assume that there hasn't been a major policy change with regard to this, because we're talking about a fairly minor issue, and of course it's in the interest of the Sunak government as well to contribute to continue these kind of
absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be it's going to be a very technocratic government, and like you explained, it makes perfect sense for the UK and the EU. So I don't see any reason why they would want to deviate from such an obvious policy course. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I remember that administration or government of Liz Truss also announced that there would eventually be a new defense policy review that the UK would conduct. And the fate of that as well, like during this under this government, I'm not sure of, but I would assume that processes like defense and security policy processes that were put in place under the previous government, I mean, would also like continue. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think this is an extremely positive step for the European Union and the UK in the post-Brexit relationship, and it could really help build positive goodwill and like positive like feelings on both sides that could ultimately then enhance collective European security, like NATO's like deterrence posture, and make Europe a little bit more responsive. I mean, if it eventually succeeds in the aims and goals that it's set out to do.
Yeah, I don't suppose there's been much of an international response.
No, not too much, because I mean it's like I mentioned, it's even in the British national press, it hasn't been noticed like that much. I've seen a couple of news articles. There was one good article in the Times, but beyond that, it has gone rather unnoticed, I would say.
Right.
Also in Brussels-based media, rather unnoticed, which is somewhat surprising, like given that it's still a relatively big policy change in London, like after Brexit. But I would assume that perhaps London would like to keep it, or the government in Whitehall would like to keep it relatively under wraps and do it in a low-key way to avoid creating
a whole story out of it.
Exactly. Avoid kind of creating a story that would then inevitably attract the Eurosceptic press, attract attention from Eurosceptic members of the British Parliament, and then get sucked into again. Into
a whole
this
conversation about who we are, what we are.
What we stand for. And
the Conservative Party spent so much time divided. I think they're trying to avoid that whole conversation as much as they can.
Exactly, and I think kind of it's a smart way to do, and it's starting something positive by cooperating on something rather technical and unsexy, rather than like going all guns blazing, like all industries
rejoining the single market tomorrow.
Exactly. So
of course.
So I think it's a good way to go. And we have to see like what the eventual kind of outcomes are, and if this positive dynamic, if we can already call it a positive dynamic. I think it's a bit difficult to call it a positive dynamic because it's not really super in the public eye yet. But it really suggests that like, I mean, there has been like some form of mentality change in London towards the European Union, partly out of necessity, partly out of politics. But whether it will continue, I mean, we have to see, of course.
Yeah.
And I think unless I don't really like have anything else to say, I think I'm just kind of interested to see, I mean, what will happen. Do you have any other points to mention, like Theo, that I didn't think of earlier?
Well, I suppose I'd be curious, I'd be curious what you think the next or the future for UK EU cooperation could hold if this indeed proves fruitful for both sides, as it most probably will. Where they could turn their attention to next.
No, it's a good point. Good question. I mean, it's
because, like you mentioned, obviously, the outlying issues, fisheries, the Northern Ireland Protocol, etc. But as you say, those are more politically loaded topics, which they might not want to get into immediately. So I suppose I'm curious to know where they might then. We've kind of freed ourselves from the reality TV Brexit that has animated the conversation for so long.
I like that saying, reality TV Brexit. Yeah.
Well, I have very, very strong memories, if I can use that term, of Theresa May trying to get her Brexit deal voted on, and 3 times it was voted off. It was voted down by members of her own party, and she had to resign shortly afterwards, or a few months afterwards. So that, to me, is like reality TV Brexit, and thankfully we've passed that, and it's returned to the quiet negotiating rooms full of suits. I don't know.
And skirts.
And skirts, of course. It is. It is the modern day. But I suppose, I don't know, perhaps, I guess, obviously supply chains might be a big one, just by virtue of necessity. Perhaps agriculture. A lot's been said about the UK struggling with temporary workers for their soft fruits industry, for instance. They've had to. There's a whole national conversation. Do we want to have a soft fruits industry if we can't get the people to pick them? So I have no idea, but I can imagine that there's going to be a fair few areas where they're going to want to focus their attention on.
Yeah, absolutely. And like there's so many policy areas that have suffered from Brexit, and not only of Brexit, but then just this like general, I think, political nastiness and verbal hostility that we've seen over the past kind of couple of years, which have really damaged things, unfortunately. But I think, I mean, if this, and I mean the UK's participation in the very technical military mobility project will help create this more positive dynamic that we discussed, then I could easily envision that eventually the UK could sign a framework participation agreement with the EU that would make it possible for Britain, for example, to participate in some EU military and civilian missions, which would not be completely out of the question.
For sure, it's a logical step.
It would be a logical step, and it's something that Britain could really, in which Britain could play a really meaningful and effective role, because Britain has one of the most capable, or perhaps the most capable, like armed forces in Europe at the moment. Or I think it's a duel between France and Britain. Always.
I'm afraid I'm rather biased on that.
Yeah.
Don't know if I would agree.
But that is certainly something, and I think that would be quite welcomed as well. And then I think what the timeline of all this would be, it's hard to say, but it depends, I think, fundamentally on what the comfort level back in London is, how happy and how willing the government in London is to cooperate more actively with the European Union in different policy fields in which it's not already cooperating. But like I said earlier, I mean, I think geography dictates to some extent, and that we'll eventually we'll see more and more closer cooperation like between the two sides, because Brexit hasn't like changed the fundamental like rules of geography like in Europe, and there are still like a lot of necessity for the UK and the European Union to cooperate. And I mean, it's we are where we are at the moment, and that is finally some good news, I think, in the post-Brexit relationship. So I think I don't think I have anything else to add to today's episode, and I would just like to thank you, Theo, like for being here again. Like it's been really nice to like talk to you again about this stuff.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And I hope all of you like who joined the podcast have listened like to today, have enjoyed listening to today's discussion. And please stay tuned. Like we'll record hopefully at least one more podcast before the end of the year, so you'll have something to tune into and listen to before the end of the year. And perhaps we'll make that one out of the US midterms, like given that this was supposed to be the US midterm episode, but we'll see. Perhaps I'll come up with something else on last minute. But anyways, hopefully all of you will have a pleasant day, a good morning or pleasant afternoon, wherever you are. And talk to you again soon. Bye.
That was today's episode of Defence Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.